So welcome. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time out of your day to join this webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Susan Martin, and I work for the Colorado River program, and I'm our Water Projects and Sustainable Finance Director. We're really excited to host Fred Phillips and engage in a discussion about large-scale restoration and conservation, particularly in partnering with Native American tribes today. So before we get started, I just want to walk through kind of the order of operations that we've outlined. So Glenn Prickett is going to start us off today by setting the stage and doing an introduction of Fred. And then Fred will then give his webinar and presentation. And we're hoping to have about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to open up for questions and also for discussion. So a couple of housekeeping items. I think I already said this, but I'll say it again. I think that everyone upon entry is muted, but if you're not, make sure that you're muted so we can limit any background noise during Fred's presentation. We're also going to hold any questions until the very end, but if you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and write them in the chat box. And I'll be collecting those, keeping track of them, and then can use those questions as a start for facilitating a discussion at the end of the presentation. We'll start with the chat questions and then open it up for people to unmute themselves and ask additional questions if you're interested in doing that directly. And then the last thing I wanted to note is that we are actually recording this webinar, so it will be available for folks to share with colleagues that were unable to join after the webinar. With that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Glenn. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted?
Now you're good. Oh.
How's that?
That's better.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. We got a great group on the line. We appreciate it. I'm Glenn Prickett, Chief External Affairs Officer, and I'm really pleased to introduce Fred Phillips. I met Fred just a few months ago, actually. We were introduced by a mutual friend who is both a neighbor of mine here in Great Falls, Virginia, and also a former colleague at the U.S. Agency for International Development named Bob Gersoni. Bob is a very serious guy. He's worked in some pretty intense settings all around the world. So when he said I should meet Fred and learn about the great work he's doing with river restoration, I said, I'd better meet Fred. So we actually had one of the best meetings you can have. We took a hike for about an hour along the Potomac River here in Virginia, just above the Great Falls. And I was very interested in the work he's done over the last 25 years, largely in the American Southwest, in Arizona and Texas, but also now in Virginia. Both to restore rivers, but also to do that in collaboration with Native American tribes and communities. And so I thought that work would be of interest to a lot of people at the Nature Conservancy who both work on rivers and river restoration, and also whom are working with local communities and particularly indigenous communities. So I got in touch with Khaki Andrews and Taylor Hawes, and Season and Kat stepped in, and here we are with this webinar. So as I said, Fred has been working on river restoration for 25 years. He has his own consulting practice for 20 of those years. And prior to that, he was working with Native American tribes in Arizona. And with that, and he has a master's in landscape architecture from Purdue before he got into his work on rivers. So with that, I will hand it over to Fred.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Well, good morning, everyone. This is the first webinar I've ever done, so it's kind of interesting presenting to my screen as opposed to an audience of people. So I'll just try to imagine all of you out there. But I really appreciate you all joining today. Like Glenn said, we had a walk in the woods not too long ago and thought that this would be a great idea. And today I want to share with you several projects that I've done on the Colorado River with communities and Native Americans. Another project in Indonesia that I think is very interesting as far as scaling restoration. And the reason for this, obviously, to share with fellow practitioners and folks that are concerned with conservation, but I also, as a practitioner, I have finished up some larger projects, so I'm looking for future partnerships with my work. So with that, just like to start with a let's see, I don't seem, okay, here we go. I wanted to start with this picture because, basically the last 25 years, my passion has been restoring rivers. All of my work is focused primarily on conservation and restoration. And in the southwestern United States and across the world, as you can see in this river, the Mangkok River of Bangka, Indonesia, this is where this river is actually mined for tin that's used in the electronics industries. And I'll get into that a little later. But it just exemplifies, I think, what has happened to a lot of our watersheds in the United States and abroad, and how this work is important and needs to be done. I'm going to start on the Colorado River. I seem to be, okay, here we go. Many of you know this is the most loved and litigated river in the United States. 4 major dams, 5 smaller weir dams. The cycle of flooding and the things that rivers need to survive, essentially erased over the last 100 years. This is a hydrograph below Hoover Dam. As you can see, prior to 1935 in the construction of the dam, there were cycles of up to 130,000 CFS to 3,000 to 5,000. And in the last 80 years, that's been reduced to a pretty minimal flood cycle on the river. So that and the introduction of agricultural development and everything has basically reduced riparian areas in the Colorado River watershed by about 90%. Seeing that riparian areas in the Southwest support 1/3 of all plant and animal species, and 90% has been destroyed, this has created a problem for wildlife, water quality, et cetera. So back when I was a student at Purdue University, my first job was with the Colorado River Indian tribes. This is the chairman of the tribe, Dennis Patch. And when I got to the reservation, they basically wanted to restore part of the river there back to what it used to be, which is, when I got there, primarily salt cedar, dry marshes, etc. So when I started working for the tribe, my approach as a young practitioner was to basically just start talking with people. And I spent a lot of time, this is John Scott, a Navajo elder who lived on the reservation, talking to the elders of the reservation and seeing, what they had witnessed happen to the river over the years and what they would like to see come back. And past that, I started conversations with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Game and Fish, Bureau of Reclamations, to see, what plans were out there for the river, if there was any other ideas or information I could gather. And then in a little storage room on the reservation, I was just myself at the time, came up with a master plan to restore 1,000 acres of riparian and wetland habitat and create low impact recreation for the tribe. So over the next 5 years, working with the tribe, we developed, one of the first things that we did was try to get people reconnected with the river. We wrote a grant for some canoes and outdoor equipment. I started to take tribal youth on river trips, and some of the tribal leadership and members would join us to get some interest going on the river, as well as one of our first initial grants was to start a native plant nursery. There was no native plant nurseries in the region. We started with a $10,000 grant and grew 3,000 trees. And then this was the nursery about 4 years later. We're growing 50 native trees a year and selling them to regional projects, and also supplying all of the native plant material for our own restoration. Over the course of the 5 years, one of the big parts of the project was to rechannel some of the oxbows on the Colorado River. This 1,000-acre area had essentially been cut off from any flows from the river, from the levee system that was built in the 1960s to efficiently move water on the Colorado. So this was the dredging operation that we did. We excavated approximately 600,000 cubic yards of dirt to rechannel these areas. We blew holes in the levees to restore flow through the river into these marshes. And then another major component was to remove the salt cedar from these areas and revegetate that with cottonwood willow. Now, this being my first project, I had some great failures, and this is one of them. These were some cottonwoods. This is about 100 acres of cottonwoods that we grew. You can see they're on drip irrigation. In under 3 years, we had 15 to 20 foot tall trees. Things were looking good. But then I learned my first lesson with riparian restoration that cottonwoods and willows definitely need that flood hydrology to thrive. So in a matter of 6 years, this area that looked good had died. So, as I went along in this project, I was already starting to update and refine my practice and my BMPs for the project. Another thing that we did on the project that I think would be of interest was developed a sort of a conservation corps. It wasn't a formal conservation corps. It was basically just me hiring local youth and everything. But some of these gentlemen are now tribal council members. Some of them now do natural resource work for the tribe. This picture was taken 24 years ago. So when I left the reservation, I started my own practice. And one of the first jobs that I did was down in Yuma, Arizona. The Yuma East Wetlands was another 1,200 acre area. And the thing about this project that was different, it was made up of tribal land, city land, farmers. There was something like 15 different landowners and agencies that had to be involved to do the project. So Bruce Babbitt, when he was in office, called this area unrestorable. The lack of river flows, the insane crime. This is right on the border, so there was a lot of immigration issues in the area. People didn't want to touch it. So Yuma hired me. I was crazy enough to take it on. This is a picture of sort of what exemplifies the East Wetlands when we started the project. 100% non-native Tamarisk, Phragmites, trash dumps. There was meth labs in this area. I mean, it was one of the most unhospitable areas I've ever worked in. So we started out by, basically getting into the dirt and exploring the area. This is Phragmites, which is worldwide non-native, at least where it's not native. We are sitting about 15 feet off of the ground here. You can see a little tunnel in the back that we crawled up. Just gives you an idea of how dense and unproductive this habitat was. So we explored the wetlands. We did delineation of the area. We worked a lot with the Quitsan Indian tribe. Once again, I had a lot of lunches with farmers. I worked with tribal elders, tribal council, to get all of their visions for the project so I could put that together into a cohesive plan. Another lesson learned that I had early on was that you also have to identify the politics, the available funding, and most importantly in Arizona, the actual water that is available for restoration. This is the chairman of the Quitsan tribe, the mayor of Yuma, and Senator John Kyle when we did our dedication for our first pilot project. So we had a lot of good political support on this project. We had a mess of an area to work with, but we did have water, and we got all of the stakeholders to sign on the overall plan for the project. So we came up with the restoration plan for the area. Essentially, once again, re-meander, reconnect the river to the old oxbows, remove non-native vegetation, create low-impact recreation for the community. And like I said, as I was going along, continually redefining our best management practices. One of the challenges on the lower Colorado with restoration is people were planting trees and drip irrigating them, but there was no understory, and that would always leave plenty of room for non-natives to be reintroduced. So one thing that I did on this project was explored all of the native understory vegetation, the different grasses, forbs, and flowers grew. And we experimented for a number of years with how we could establish understory quickly to outcompete non-natives, to add that component of habitat to the area. And we narrowed it down to about 6 different species we could do pretty simple applications with. This is a revegetation site after we cleared salt cedar. This is the same area about 4 months later with a native understory and a mesquite bosque. So as you can see, this understory component, I think, really helped revolutionize some of the restoration on the lower Colorado, at least. It's really increased habitat. It reduced our herbicide use by probably 70% and was really effective. This is a picture of the East Wetlands, an aerial view. The channel on the upper third is the meander that we re-excavated. On the lower Colorado, there's no more flooding, but there are high water flows when all of the farmers cancel the water orders, because water will be released from Hoover Dam as the farmers order it, and we'll get a rain event, they'll cancel their water orders, and there's nowhere for the water to go. So what we do, we open up our structures, we flood the wetlands, as you can see in this picture. This is a picture of the site a couple years after we started. And then this is an area view of the East Wetlands today. It's now about 400 acres of restored riparian wetland and aquatic. There's a couple parks, trails, and it's hosting an abundance of endangered threatened species now as well. We also did some work down on the Mexican border a few miles down. Once again, this is a before picture after all of the non-natives were removed. This is an after picture of the restored cottonwood willow grasslands. This was in a matter of about 1.5 years. With a 360-day-a-year growing season, you know, if you put the right plant in the right place in the desert, they grow really fast. Once again, like I said, you know, when I started in Parker, made plenty of mistakes and failures, but by the time I left Yuma, you know, I'd really honed in my best management practices for doing this restoration. This is a picture of an old oxbow. This water had like 30,000 parts per million salinity. So you could probably raise tuna there, but not native fish. And then you can see the background of salt cedar and Phragmites. This is the area about 5 years later. Restored marsh, wetlands, cottonwood willow forest. And then the foreground is a park that we designed for the Quitsan Indian tribe. This is on their part of the tribal land. And this was all done through grant funding as well, the entire project. Another thing that we've done a lot with our projects is getting the community together to not only teach some of the practices that we know, but also share with other practitioners their lessons learned. So we've done workshops where we bring tribal folks in, other consultants, agencies, the Nature Conservancy participated in a few of them. So we do this in the region so we can help share that information, and hopefully that can transfer out to other projects and other people's work. I don't think that's my phone. One of the exciting things that we did in Yuma and we've done on our projects is also monitor the wildlife and the salinity in the soil and the vegetation. Over the course of the 2 decades I worked in Yuma, we did some riparian research as well as butterfly and insects. And in a nutshell, you know, the restored riparian sites in Yuma had 4 times the density and diversity of birds than the non-native sites unrestored. Then we also studied the butterfly community. That's indicative of the overall health of the insect community. Restored sites had 5 times higher richness and abundance of butterflies than the unrestored habitats. So, you know, in under 15 years, we really transformed this area. One of the most exciting parts of the project, besides the community was the species coming back. This is the endangered Yuma clapper-rail. We now have 3 different pairs nesting and breeding in there. California leaf-nosed bat, Yuma hispid cotton rat, which the multi-species conservation program who monitors this, we have the largest population on the entire river. It's because of that grassland component. And a real exciting thing that happened a few weeks ago is we discovered some nesting, breeding yellow-billed cuckoos in one of our restoration sites. So, you know, once again, yet another covered species that is utilizing the area. So we've had some great luck with this. These ESA species coming back into the site actually got the MSCP interested enough that they adopted the entire project, and they are now taking care of the operation and maintenance of the habitats for the next 50 years, really securing that legacy. So pretty exciting. So another project I'll just touch really quickly on, as they say, scale it and nail it. Had a couple big projects under our belt. We were awarded a design contract with the Bureau of Reclamation to design the Laguna project. This is the largest restoration on the entire Colorado River done to date. Almost 2,000 acres. We took all of those lessons learned that we had experienced over the years and applied it to the design of this project. As you can see, it involved moving about 1.5 million cubic yards of dirt, putting a pipe into the headworks of Imperial Dam, removing salt cedar and non-natives from the entire area, and then rerouting the river. You can see on the lower left of this picture, a pipeline goes underneath this canal and comes up again, and that's where the pipe from the headworks of Imperial Dam fed the flow into this wetland. So this was during the construction of the project, and then this was after planting, about a year after planting. This site now hosts an abundance of endangered threatened species that are under the MSCP program, and a pretty beautiful restoration. Another component of my work is the Walton Family Foundation hired me back when they started talking about the pulse flow into the Colorado River Delta. I'm sure you all know about Razor River. TNC's been very involved and effective with that project. I was hired to just be part of the steering committee that was deciding on the timing of the flow, how we could get the timing of the pulse flow to germinate the most amount of cottonwood willow, and think about ways to most efficiently use the water. This was below Morales Dam. This is during the pulse flow back in, I believe it was 2015 or so. I'm not sure exactly, can't remember the date. But usually there's no flow below this dam, and this is when they started to let the water go. This is the river channel below Morales Dam prior to the pulse flow, a few weeks before it. And then this was the river channel during the pulse flow. I, with Pete McBride, who's a photographer, and this is Rowan from Outside Magazine, and Sam Walton, got on some paddle boards, and we rode the flow as far as we could. I don't have many claims to fame, but I'll share one with you now. I think I'm one of 3 people in the world that actually butt dammed the Colorado River. This is when we paddled down and ran out of water. There just happened to be an earthen dam. I believe Eloise and Peter Culp and Jennifer Pitt found an excavator to come let the water through, and we showed up at about that same time. So we sat down and had a beer and butt dammed the Colorado for a few hours before we let it go. One of the results of this pulse flow was really bolstering the native habitat that was in this dry river corridor. It also created new habitat. A lot of the water, I think upwards of 90% of it went straight into the groundwater, which is a strategy for long-term restoration. And another thing that came out of that was lessons learned that perhaps some of that water, instead of it being put just on the in-stream flow, we needed to focus on areas where we had good water conditions and we could do similar restoration to like we had done upstream. This is the Chausse project. The water for this project came from this canal, not the river, so it could be more efficiently put in there. This is all primarily salt cedar and Phragmites. This is that project last year. It was just planted, and there's more projects like this planned for the Delta region, as well as another pulse flow down the river to also create and enhance existing habitat. As you all in Nature Conservancy work so much with private landowners, I thought this might be of interest. This is on the Rio Grande in far west Texas, near Presidio, Texas. I worked with the Trans-Pecos Water Trust. This is Terry Bishop. He has a 1,000-acre farm on the river. 900 of those acres are fallow now. So he was another land-rich farmer with issues as far as keeping the farm. So we talked to him about trying to get the city of Presidio to use its effluent to restore 20 acres of wetland habitat on his land with the Trans-Pecos Water Trust over a few years. We secured the effluent for his property. This area was just basically a dry farm field, and we diverted the water, and over the course of the last few years, it's turned into a real gem of a wetland. And this is, one of those opportunities, I think, with anyone, and TNC as well. Terry has 900 acres of fallow land that's in the floodplain of the Rio Grande, and there's other ranches and farms on the Rio Grande that I've worked with that are interested in doing this kind of conservation. So definitely an opportunity there. So I'm going to skip real quick over to Indonesia and the EICC to come up with this strategy to help mitigate damages that were caused on the Bangka Island through tin mining. About 40% of the world's tin comes from Bangka. There's over 40,000 illegal miners there, a lot of them children, and there's a lot of deaths every year from the dangers of mining. But the mining is what's driving all of the land degradation on the island. This is the Mangkok River in Bangka. These are all tin mines along the river, most of them illegal. And this is one of the illegal mining camps that we visited. They were a pretty happy community, but they were also children doing this mining all day for pennies. So we worked with the mining industry in Indonesia, Conservation International, nonprofits in Indonesia to come up with how we could create alternative livelihoods for these miners. And basically, what they wanted to do is come up with some new laws and processes to create more mitigation and restore this land back into something productive. So, we researched the soils, the waters. We talked with a lot of folks. This is when we cleared out a room in a hotel with the NGOs and some of the mining officials and came up with a concept plan. And basically, this was a 50-acre pilot project on a piece of mined land that could be scaled to thousands of acres. And we came up with two different concepts. One was to create basically a farm of non-food products that could be grown in this degraded soil, like vetiver grass, citronella, other products that have a local, regional, and national market that could help drive an economy to try to get these miners out of mining and into agriculture or to conservation. I spoke to one miner when I was there. I said, what would it take for you to go from being an illegal miner to a farmer? He said, well, I make about $60 a month. If I could make $61 a month doing something that was good, I would do it. So there's definitely a need there. This is a picture of this is a picture of that pilot site. You can see, basically as far as any sort of mitigation that's done after mining, there isn't. So the vision was to create two options. One was to reforest the area into critical habitat. There's several endangered species here. That could spawn sustainable timber harvesting, conservation, and the second option, probably the more viable one to create alternative livelihoods, was to create the farm with the different products that could be grown by the community. So, we also worked on redoing the mitigation manual for the mining industry, and that's being used today on Bangka. And this is the Belatung tarsius. It's the smallest monkey in the world, and it's one of the species in that area that's being impacted by all of the mining. So I'm going to finish now. I'm going to bring it back home. This is a project that we're working on currently. I think it's a great opportunity for TNC, for anybody. It's work that needs to be done. We've been working with the Navajo Nation the last few years, doing vegetation surveys and evaluating their watersheds and their rangelands. The Navajo Nation encompasses 17 million acres across northeast Arizona, divided up into several agencies. our first project was to basically go into about 500,000 acres and do rangeland surveys to determine the carrying capacity of the land for livestock and grazing. The Navajo culture, their livelihood, revolves around the health of land and livestock. We did these surveys, and it was pretty sobering. Just in the area that we work, in a matter of 8 years, the grazing capacity had reduced 26%. So obviously some of that is overgrazing. A lot of it's overgrazing, some of it's climate change, but that's pretty rapid. Multiply that times a few more decades and you're looking at a real serious issue with erosion, land degradation, not being able to graze. So they hired us to do a pilot project in a 20,000 acre side canyon called Sagi Canyon. And this area, I'm checking my time here. This area, once again, a lot of the problems with overgrazing areas, the erosion is unzipping all of the streams, the exotic plants there. I mean, the carrying capacity of this canyon is about 1/10 of what is actually in there right now. So we looked at this area and came up with the strategy to defer this area, to rest the land, to do riparian restoration in the area. And as the Navajos, in their culture, these canyons and watersheds to them are what carry medicine, meaning plant medicine as well as spiritual medicine. They didn't even used to graze in these areas. So to a lot of them, it's really culturally important that these areas are protected and healed again. The Sagi Canyon, which is also where Navajo National Monument is, it's 83 square miles. It drains into the eastern side of the Shanto Plateau into Laguna Creek, which I believe drops into the San Juan. Once again, we were having trouble getting the 9 families together to talk about what they wanted. So what I did was found the local restaurant that they all eat in, and we bought 50 breakfasts, and this became sort of our meeting room over the last few years. And they've all been really great as far as participating in it and supporting the project. It's really important to them. All of the grazing permits on the Navajo reservation are essentially expired and illegal now. So BIA is trying to work with the nation to get these ranchers, these permit holders, to come up with conservation plans and to do more of this stuff to heal the land. The vision we came up with the project, probably one of the best vision statements I've had. The landowners and ones that came up with it, obviously to create a holistic relationship between Mother Earth, Father, Son, a really beautiful way to think about conservation. And then also we came up with a list of BMPs that had come from our 20 years of experience, from everything from doing chemical control to erosion control structures to the native plant restoration techniques. So we have basically, our guide that we share to guide the practices. So the first project that we'll be doing actually next month is we got all of the ranchers to agree to defer the first 1,000 acres of this canyon. Currently, this area has a carrying capacity of 17 sheep units. There are over 500 sheep units being used in it. So, and that's kind of across the board in a lot of places on the Navajo reservation. And these are all the watersheds that feed the San Juan, the Colorado rivers. So they've agreed to defer this area for 5 years. And then hopefully when we're finished with this, we're going to continue deferring the entire canyon over the next 5 years. And then when we can get it back to a good health, go back in with the number of livestock that it can handle and do healthy raising of livestock and maintain the health of the canyon. So that's the strategy. And this is just a picture of the fence location. We've also been working with tribal youth, collecting and propagating plants for this project that they've been growing in local nurseries and Flagstaff. And it's probably insanity, but this is the area that we're building the livestock fence across. We have to use rock drills. We have to drive 10 miles into a very remote area that gets often washed out. So it should be interesting and a good story to tell in about a month or two. To wrap things up, the last 25 years, with, with a small group, my firm has ranged from 2 people up to 20. But with our small unit and the people we work with, we've raised over 15 million in grants for conservation and restoration. We've restored over 3,000 acres of habitat on the Colorado and Rio Grande, and have helped the Navajo and agencies do millions of acres of planting that are planned for restoration and conservation. A lot of those plans are being implemented now, and created a lot of full and part-time jobs that a lot of times we've effectively worked ourselves out of a job in these communities, because the people that work for my business eventually end up working for the NGOs or the cities that we work in, so they can carry on the program. So in closing, I've really been honored to work with all the tribes in the Southwest. This is John Scott Sr. He's a Navajo elder and medicine man. He's been a dear friend of mine for 20 years, and he's been a guide for me for working with tribes and respecting their culture and just life in general. And, the other important part of this work to me is just, the Iroquois. I'm sure every decision they make, they base it on 7 generations. With all of the challenges going on with the environment and water and everything, I think it's really important that we're protecting these areas for future generations. So I was thinking with, when Glenn and I were talking, I was just thinking of some possibilities, I think, with engaging with Native American tribes. I mean, I work with many tribes in Arizona, and I know that there's a lot of interest. Just a couple quick things to throw across the bow. The Crit tribe has over 700,000 acre-feet of water rights. That's more than the state of Nevada. They still have 100,000 acres of degraded riparian areas on the reservation. They could be a real model for how water transactions, how stuff can be scaled on reservations. The Quitsan Indian tribe in Yuma, now that they've seen what can happen to their land, they're really interested in large-scale restoration. The Navajo Nation, as I said before, they have millions of acres, rangelands, canyons, watersheds, joblessness. I mean, it's a pretty bad situation as far as the health of the land and the jobs. So I think there's a real opportunity there to create, more education, more partnerships, more collaboration to get people doing more of this stuff that these permit holders are doing in Sagi Canyon. In Arizona, there's talk. It's not happening yet, but there's a possibility of tribes being able to develop mitigation banks or conservation easements, things of that nature. They need some type of revenue for their long-term health. So there's a real opportunity there. I've been involved with some of that work in Arizona to develop rapid assessment methods for ephemeral washes and streams to create a scoring system so banks can be established. And then a couple of last ones, just tribal training programs like the Southwest Conservation Corps in Durango. They work with a lot of Navajo youth doing awesome stuff. That could be done on a much larger scale. And then just collaborating with tribes. I think some of the tribes I've worked with, I think there's a willingness to do it. They just don't really see what the possibilities are. So I think working with tribes on the Colorado or anywhere for that, what is conservation actions they want to take, and then and trying to expand and explore what the other opportunities are. So that's it. I think I came in just a little over, Kat. Really appreciate your attention. I think there's still some people out there. I can only see Kat and Season, but I really appreciate your time, and thank you for what you all do.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred, for that presentation. So now we have about a little less than 20 minutes for discussion and questions from folks that have been joining us. If you guys want, feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and I can keep track of that and ask those to Fred. You can also unmute yourself and ask a question directly. So let me pause for a moment and see if anyone has any questions that are burning that they want to ask, and let us know if you have any issues unmuting yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Sarah Murdoch.
Hi, Sarah.
Yeah.
Hi, Fred. Thanks for that. That was a great compilation of work that you presented. It was really interesting. I work at the federal level on federal policy. So my question is related to what funding sources and policies do you think have been most instrumental in facilitating some of this work in the United States?
It's a great question. Well, a lot of the funding that we've gotten has come through the Bureau of Reclamation on the lower Colorado River, the multi-species conservation plan, basically mitigation for how they manage the Colorado River. So that program has been really instrumental on the Colorado. It seems like the last year, the private foundation funding has become a lot more important. It seems that some of the federal funding pots for conservation, restoration, and grants have either been really slow or starting to dry up. So, as far as, I think if the Clean Water Act, or if the Clean Water Act is impacted and compensatory mitigation was changed, I think that would have a really negative impact on the work that I do, at least, thinking off the top of my head. It seems like a lot of this money is always driven, through endangered species mitigation.
Thanks.
Hi, Fred. This is Celine Hawkins, and thanks again for your presentation. I was wondering if you could give us some advice about what sort of is a proper or productive role for a conservation organization to play in a tribal project that's designed to meet tribal goals.
Well, I know, at least with the SEGI and the Human Mini projects, I think at least working with BIA, I'll just use Navajo as an example. The BIA and the Navajo Nation have worked pretty closely because they have to reissue all these grazing permits, and whenever there's a federal nexus on the project, the BIA has to be involved. The foundations that I'm working with now on the Navajo, they've been welcomed right in, as far as as they want to see more of these areas conserved and protected. I think that just introducing and meeting and talking with tribes is a great first step. I think one of the roles could be helping identify, what from the experience of the foundations or agencies have that they could bring to the table to help the tribe figure out, where can we get funding for this? How, where are the experts we can hire to help with this? How can we get training, to do this stuff ourselves and build capacity? Those are some of the key things that I always see with tribes, because I know all of the people that I'm working with in Navajo now are really excited about more collaboration and getting more work done.
Hi, my name's, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but my name is Mari Liberati, and thank you for sharing the landscape designs. And I was curious, in implementing, how close did your on-the-ground implementation match kind of your design? And if you could speak to environmental or even shifts in community wishes and desires that changed some of those plans.
Well, some of the drawings I shared with you are the initial conceptual drawings of the project, and that's what we'll usually do when we're just fundraising and permitting and stuff like that. A lot of the projects, there's another level of engineering design and revegetation design. So we usually start with the concept, we'll get the funding, and then do further surveys. I would say, the Yuma design, the Laguna design, the biggest one, I would say was pretty close to what we designed. We're always in the field adjusting, obviously it's impossible to know, where bird nests or stands of certain trees are or certain water conditions. So we're always adjusting real time in the field. But I've found that a lot of the time, the stakeholders that we work with, are basically counting on us to get the maximum amount of habitat and efficiency out of the design. So a lot of times they'll defer to us. If we run into a challenge or a roadblock or something, that's when we'll go back to the stakeholders and say, hey, we need to adjust this. These are the options. What do you all think? So, that's been the process with the practice.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Maybe while you guys are thinking, I had one. I noticed one of the things you talked a lot about, Fred, was bringing people into the conversation really early on in your design process. So how have you had success integrating traditional ecological knowledge into the restoration planning, design, and implementation? And kind of what process or conversations have really worked to facilitate that for you?
So the question was, how
have you integrated traditional ecological knowledge into your restoration planning and design?
Well, we always, as you all as practitioners know, we really try not to reinvent any wheels. We really try to find everything we can on a certain project or a certain method that we're working on. And our approach most of the time is to try to use like 95% of what we know is going to work. We have a high level of certainty on a lot of projects, at least on the Colorado, is what's going to work or not. And then we'll experiment with 5% of the project and try new things and methods. And then, if they don't work, then, we didn't waste all the money of the project. That they work really well, we'll incorporate that into the next project. So, and a lot of times if someone, like I said, a lot of this is teaming. So if we get something thrown at us that we really don't know about or know how to do, we'll go bird dog and find the expert that does and bring them onto the team and do that. So, and then we're always updating and redefining our best management practices for everything we do as well. So that's where those workshops are really handy. We did some with the Tamarask Coalition, getting everybody together, like you and Celine and Taylor, and sharing notes. That's been a real effective tool for not reinventing wheels.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else with any questions? You can enter them into the chat box and also unmute yourself and ask directly if you want.
Yeah, and if anyone has, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, hey, Fred, it's Glenn. I just had one question, kind of goes back to the one Sarah asked about the financing. So you mentioned mitigation funding as a result of federal policies. You mentioned foundation grants. It's kind of sobering, as you said, to think that if the policies weaken, the mitigation funding could go down, and TNC is working hard on that to prevent that from happening. But have you seen any other opportunities on the horizon for other sources of financing to try to scale up these kinds of projects besides, philanthropy and sort of policy-driven, public policy-driven funding?
I think mitigation banking is definitely a big opportunity. If there is the demand, that's a tough thing about mitigation banking. There has to be destruction of it to be a demand for it to restore land. But if there is, I think that's definitely an opportunity. One thing I thought of after the question Sarah asked was also the Farm Bill. I've seen a lot of restoration fundings come through the Farm Bill, but it seems like sometimes, a certain area that has better politics gets more heavily funded through that, and some of these more remote areas that don't have the lobbyists and the players to get funding like the Navajo or some of the reservations where that's a challenge. So, I think, mitigation, I think, it's just one thing, it's the mitigation in the ESA seems to be a real big driver of a lot of this restoration. I know like in Virginia, the conservation easement program is really great. Maybe that's something that could be adopted in some of these other states where it's not quite as strong, because that's one thing I've been really impressed with in Virginia.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Virginia is one of, I think, still only 2 states in the country that has a state tax credit for the donation of conservation easements. Yeah, that's a good thought.
Tens of thousands of acres. Really great for land-rich, cash-poor families.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Fred.
You're welcome, Glenn.
Hey, this is Aaron Citron out in Colorado, and just wanted to add that on the funding side, Colorado completed a state water plan about 2 years ago, and one of the elements that's identified in there is the need for both river restoration and flow improvement projects, so riparian issues as well as flow issues. And TNC and partners are actively working to increase existing state funding allocations to programs that pay for this kinds of work, maybe not at the scale currently that was discussed earlier, but it's something that there's an active conversation right now about bringing more state funding into play for everything from stream bank restoration to stream flow enhancements to agricultural infrastructure that can have flow improvements and fish passage improvements and recreation improvements, et cetera. So it's definitely on our radar out here in Colorado, and I think in a number of other Colorado River Basin states.
Yeah, that's great, Aaron. That also reminds me too that I know tribes are also exploring the water banking. Can they lease their water to other people or to restoration? It's a pretty big challenge that they're trying to meander through, but I know.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, Kat, I can't hear you. Never mind. So I guess maybe one last question for you, Fred. As you mentioned, it feels like there's a lot of opportunity to work with Native American tribes across the U.S. So what would be the biggest piece of advice that you would give to us, TNC, as practitioners on how to begin those partnerships with tribes if we don't already have existing relationships?
Well, it's probably similar to what TNC's been doing for a long, long time and approaching, conservative farmers or landowners. I think a lot of it is it's finding the right person, on the reservation, finding the person that's in their resource department, or finding that tribal councilman who has a real passion for doing conservation on the reservation, and then just starting a relationship with that person, and I'm sure like a lot of you, I've bought a lot of breakfast with a lot of farmers and Native Americans just to discuss, what the pathway was. And when I have been able to begin develop relationships with those tribal members or people within the tribal agencies, or the most effective has been finding the councilman that wants to make this stuff happen. Those relationships seem to be a gateway for getting in there and gaining trust. And it's like all relationships, as it takes time and it takes some trust and patience. But my experience with tribes is, once you've developed that relationship and that trust, you're in. You can't. Most Navajo elders, when you meet them, a lot of them don't talk to you the first time or two you meet them, which is really unsettling. But if you can weather through that, before you know it, they're talking more than you are most of the time when you meet them. So, it's just that relationship building and finding the key people within those tribes to meet. I mean,
Great, thanks.
I would say too, the other thing is tribal elders. You got to connect with the elders. If you know every tribe I've worked for, we're doing stuff with council and people, but I'll always find the elder groups and give them slideshows and tell them what's going on and help them with things. And they're the ones that are always sitting in the back of the tribal council chambers, helping make decisions. So I would say also engaging with the elders of the tribe is a really important thing as well. And knowing their traditions.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. I think I got one question in the chat box. I think we have time for the final question. Suzanne was curious if impact investment funding or low interest loans could be a potential source of funding for tribes. Have you heard that in any of your discussions, Fred?
I haven't, but I think it's definitely a possibility. I mean, the Navajo Nation and Hopi have the lowest per capita income in the United States. So they're looking at any and all options to improve their livelihood and job creation and economies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Suzanne, and we've been trying to figure out a way that might work. I'm in Iowa. We've got water quality issues, hydrology issues. So we've been looking at some of that where the downstream communities get a benefit. But, just thinking about your range restoration project, there, and maybe not a lot, is there income that's going to be produced later from that? So, is there some, I don't know, social investing that people could be potentially interested in? I think it's a hard nut to crack, but, it makes me.
I think it's a hard one, but I do know, like with the Sagi project, like right now there's, 100 cows in there that are barely alive. So they're not going to go to market as U.S. prime. So the strategy is to get the health of the canyon back, develop a cooperative with the families that are in there, and raise 20 prime cattle, in 5 years when they can do that. And this is just 20,000 acres. You're talking 17 million acres on the Navajo. So if they could, as a strategy, just get these lands back to health and start raising good beef, because most of the families aren't using these for food anymore. They're sold.
Yeah.
So, that's definitely a part of I think the social investing could definitely be an interesting approach to it.
Well, I think we are at our time. Thank you, Fred, for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. And we are sharing the recording of this video with folks for you to share around to colleagues who weren't able to join.
And if I can just say, if anyone wants to contact me later, I'm happy to share what I know. The BMPs or stuff I have, I'm happy to share whatever I have. So, and thank you all for doing awesome work across the world.
Wonderful.
Hey, Fred. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody.
Thanks, Fred.